Every weapon in Monster Hunter Wilds has three main stats: attack, which is self-explanatory; affinity, which is your critical hit chance; and elemental, which, well, the game has never really explained it properly. If you want to optimize your hunts and maximize your damage, you need to understand how elemental damage works and whether it's actually worth focusing on or not. Let's break it all down. The first question that we're going to answer is, what is elemental damage? Elemental damage is separate from raw attack power and gets added on top of it after all other calculations. Let me tell you what I mean. Here's something most players don't realize. The elemental damage number you see in the menu is bloated. A weapon showing 250 elemental damage doesn't actually deal 250 damage. Instead, you divide that number by 10, so a 250 elemental weapon actually deals 25 elemental damage per hit. Want to see the real attack value for raw damage? Turn on the damage without coefficient option in this setting. But keep in mind, elemental numbers will still appear inflated. Alright, now we know what elemental damage is, and now it's time to answer what affects elemental damage. Let's talk about it. There are four key factors: sharpness, monster weaknesses, quest difficulty, and tempered state of that monster. So let's talk about the sharpness first. Your weapon's sharpness directly affects elemental damage. When it's red, you're losing 75% of your elemental damage, and when it's green, it's 100%, and anything about that boosted even further. Now let's talk about the monster weaknesses. Some monsters take huge elemental damage, while others barely take any. You definitely experienced that. Targeting a monster weakest point is the key to win the fights. And now let's talk about the quest difficulty. The harder the quest, the lower your elemental damage. It makes sense, to be honest. And the last factor is tempered state of that monster. Some monsters take more elemental damage when enraged, while others become more resistant. It's all depend on the individual monster that we're fighting. But here's where things can get a little tricky. Elemental attacks aren't the only thing taking up that slot on your weapon. Let's break down the difference between elemental damage and status effects, because this is where a lot of players get confused. Elemental attacks and status effects are not the same thing. They share the same weapon slot, meaning you can have either an elemental weapon or a status weapon, but not both. Elemental attacks deal direct elemental damage, like fire, water, thunder, ice, and dragon, and status effects don't deal direct damage, but instead apply a build-up effect like sleep, paralysis, or poison. For example, if a weapon shows 300 paralysis, that doesn't mean it deals 300 extra damage. Instead, it represents how quickly the weapon builds up the paralysis status on the monster. So now we know how elemental damage works and how it differs from status effects. But what about the monsters themselves? Not every creature takes damage the same way, right? And that's where weaknesses come into play. I will explain to you. As I already talked about it, every monster has different elemental weaknesses, but it's not as simple as just picking the right element. You also need to hit the right body part. When you open the large monster field guide, you'll see a weakness chart for every monster you have already fought. And as you can see, more stars means bigger weakness. Each body part has its own weakness value. For example, Zoshia is extra weak to dragon attacks on its head and neck, while other elements still work, just not as effectively. Some other monsters are even immune to certain elements. For example, Raidao is completely immune to thunder, or Guardian Arcwild is immune to all elemental attacks except on its chain blades, or Yuan Kutku immune to dragon everywhere except its neck. So understanding where to hit is just as important as what element to use. Weapons matter, but so do your skills. And if you're wondering whether affinity plays a role in elemental damage, well, it does, but not in the way you might think. So let's ask this question first: how affinity works with elemental damage. Let's quickly break down affinity, which is basically your critical hit chance. By default, affinity does not affect elemental damage. A critical hit will boost your raw attack, but your elemental damage stays the same. The only way to change these is by using the critical element skill. This skill lets your elemental attacks deal more damage on crits, but it's not the same as affinity boosting raw damage. Instead, it just gives a flat increase to elemental hits. Alright, which weapon benefits the most from elemental damage? Here's the thing. Unlike raw damage, elemental damage per hit is almost the same across all weapons. So whether you're using a greatsword or dual blades, each hit deals nearly the same elemental damage. That's why fast weapons like dual blades, insect glaives, and charge blades get the most out of elemental damage. They land way more hits. Meanwhile, slower weapons like greatsword and hammer don't benefit as much. If you're using a slow weapon, always prioritize raw attack power and affinity over elemental damage. But if you're using a fast weapon, stacking elemental attack skills first and then adding critical element is the best way to maximize your damage. In the other word, I have to tell you, elemental damage is separate from raw attacks and follows its own damage scaling. Sharpness, monster weaknesses, quest difficulty, and rage state all affect elemental damage. So I have to say fast weapons benefits the elemental damage the most, while slow weapons should focus on raw attack and affinity does not boost elemental damage unless you use the critical element skill. Now that you understand how elemental damage works, you can start optimizing your builds for maximum damage. But before you do that, if you found this guide helpful, drop a like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments what other Monster Hunter Wilds mechanic you'd like me to cover. Much love and peace out.